So thanks, Armando. Sort of broadly what this summer school is going to be about is combining neural models with sort of symbolic representations and symbolic execution models. I work on natural language processing, and in this talk, what I basically want to convince you is that when we think about building symbolic structure into neural network models, human language is one of our most powerful tools, both for sort of supervising models that work in this way and maybe even for specifying their internal representations. So I want to start with a really, really big question, which is the question of how people learn. And one of the sort of distinguishing features of human cognition is the ease with which we acquire new skills and concepts. And we do this in a bunch of different ways. When we're just like lying in the crib, before we can even control our environments, we learn by sort of compressing what we've seen so far, trying to predict what's going to happen next. Once we gain the ability to act, we learn a huge amount from interaction with our environments, from sort of exploration and trial and error. Once we understand a little bit about the social context in which we're situated, we learn from that social context, right? From sort of explicit demonstration and labeling from the teachers that are around us. And finally, once we've acquired language, we learn a whole lot via language. And it's the last of these things that I really want to focus on in this talk today. The number of things that we learn about the world from language is pretty enormous. We acquire factual knowledge, we acquire, like the causes of the First World War, we acquire procedures like how to bake a cake, we acquire even information that extends our knowledge of language itself via sort of definitions, reading encyclopedias, things like that. Most of us who are sitting in this room right now learned the things that got us here by doing things like reading papers and textbooks and talking to colleagues and sort of acquiring our knowledge through language. In fact, most of the sort of complex skills that we acquire, especially in adulthood, are delivered in this form. Of course, our ability to learn from language in this way relies on all these other kinds of learning that we were looking at on the previous slide. But once we learn language, it's really the sort of main thing that we use to acquire all of these other complicated skills. And so in particular, the ability to acquire language and maybe more importantly, to represent the things that we've learned by whatever modality in the form of language is one of the main things that separates humans from all of the other learning systems that nature has ever produced. And this has implications that show up in all kinds of surprising places. So to sort of motivate parts of this talk, I want to do a brief detour through one of my favorite psychology experiments. And the setup for this experiment is as follows. We're going to construct a rectangular room, one long wall and one short wall. And we're going to paint one wall blue so that it's clearly distinguished from the other one. So every corner in this room, notice, is uniquely identified by a conjunction of whether the long wall is on your left or your right, and whether or not there's a blue wall present. We're then going to take some sort of rewarding stimulus, and what that is going to depend on the subject of the experiment. We're going to sort of hide it away in one corner of the room. And the basic form of the experiment that we're going to run here is to place some sort of agent in this room, let them find that reward, disorient them, and ask them to find it again. Now, if you do this experiment with rats, they're not very good at it. A little less than half the time, they do the right thing, they go back to the right corner. Otherwise, they just go to the wrong corner or they give up altogether. And the conjunctive aspect of this goal specification is really important. If you set this up so that the rats just have to discriminate based on color or just based on the long or short wall, they actually do fine at this task. Now, if you do this experiment with pre-verbal human infants, they're even worse. They're also sort of split between the spatially equivalent corners, ignoring the color. Maybe unsurprisingly, if you run this experiment with human adults, almost everybody gets it right. But if you then take those adults and you hijack their language abilities by giving them what's called a verbal shadowing task, you ask them to repeat a prose passage out loud while they're sort of initially learning where the reward is located, they start behaving like rats or like pre-verbal infants. Now, this effect seems to be specific to language. If we give people cognitively demanding tasks, shadowing tasks that don't involve language, they don't produce the same effect. And so this is at least some evidence that the language faculty is specifically implicated in our ability to form compositional representations of goals, even for tasks that sort of on the surface have nothing at all to do with language. Now, all of these other kinds of learning that we talked about before correspond to like major established research directions in machine learning. They have their own conferences, they have their own textbooks, and so on and so forth. But it's really just in the last couple of years that the community has started to take seriously the possibility of learning from language in the same way that we do all of these other kinds of learning. And so what this talk is going to be about are a couple of recent projects that my group has been doing in this direction on ways of using language in support of other downstream machine learning applications, both using language to learn sort of discrete skills for interacting with environments, for learning reusable program abstractions, for program synthesis tasks, and if there's time at the end, as a tool not just for sort of teaching models what to do, but helping them explain what it is that they've learned. Cool, so let's dive right into this, starting with this problem of using language to learn skills for interacting with the environment. And this was led by my student Pratyusha Sharma in collaboration with Antonio Torralba. So I sort of briefly flashed before cooking as a canonical example of a family of skills that we learn, at least in part, with natural language guidance. And if we're going to do big, complicated things like cooking in the real world, we're going to need to start with even simpler manipulation tasks in simpler environments, doing things like finding our way around, interacting with really simple appliances and containers, and so on and so forth. So here's an example from the Alfred environment, which is a sort of simulation package designed to do exactly that. Tasks in this environment, oh, I guess this is cut off by Zoom, but include things like put a clean bowl of water on the kitchen island. And you can see that an agent that's accomplishing this task does things like walk around, find a dirty bowl, carry it to the sink. So how hard are tasks of this kind? We're mapping from images to, in this case, even a discrete action space. This feels like the sort of thing that should be straightforward with modern function approximation techniques. But in fact, if we take 20,000 demonstrations of these relatively simple tasks, and we try to train some sort of deep network policy to just map directly from these low-level observations to low-level actions, this doesn't work at all. Now, what might the reason be for this? Well, even these things that we said were really simple tasks. Sorry, this Zoom thing is going to get kind of annoying. Let me see if I can turn it off. Yeah. No. Yeah. There we go. Sorry about that. So even simple, what we've been calling simple tasks here have a lot of moving parts. At the low level, they require us to recognize objects and plan paths between visible locations. And at the high level, they require us to reason about the sort of long-term consequences of these actions. And so even a task as innocuous as put a slice of tomato on the kitchen counter requires finding a knife and grasping it, and finding a tomato and slicing it, and then grasping the slices and moving to the counter and setting them down again. And if you think about how you learn to do complex tasks like this kind of intermediate structure is really important. So how might we build a model that can reason about that kind of intermediate task structure explicitly, and how might we go about training such a model? So maybe unsurprisingly, the most effective procedures that we've had historically for building models like this look something like this. I'm going to have one model that decomposes my high-level goal into a sequence of high-level subtasks, and then I'm going to have another model that decomposes each of those subtasks into a sequence of low-level actions. And sure enough, there's a huge literature on agent architectures that work this way, but they require a lot of work to set up. They, in particular, typically require you to either formalize your entire domain symbolically and engineer some sort of symbolic planning mechanism that's specialized to the kitchen domain, or to pre-commit to some sort of fixed inventory of skills, collect a bunch of specialized demonstrations or rewards for each of those skills, collect an additional set of demonstrations of these high-level plans, and then pipeline these things together to get the final policy. And as a result, a lot of these methods don't really scale either to complex perception or really complex goals. So how might language help us do better? And if we think back to those experiments at the very beginning of the talk, the sort of key insight there is that language is a powerful tool for reasoning about this kind of high-level behavior. It can do things like tell us what features of a demonstration or past experience are meaningful and likely to generalize to new situations. And it gives us a flexible and compositional representation system that we can actually use for encoding those plans and goals. So we're going to operationalize this intuition by building a model that looks like this. Given some kind of high-level goal, we're first going to generate a sequence of natural language subgoal descriptions. And then from each of those language-based subgoal descriptions, generate a sequence of actions. Now, this looks a lot like the sort of classic hierarchical planning model that we flashed on the previous slide, but it differs in a couple of important ways. The first thing to notice here is that because each of these high-level actions is a string, the set of possible actions is itself sort of open-ended, it's compositional, unlike in a lot of these symbolic approaches where we have to commit to a set of actions up front. Here, the space of actions that we can use at this intermediate planning layer is in principle as expressive as language itself. Second, getting supervision for what the representations at this layer look like is relatively easy. Instead of having to train some sort of human annotator to use our specialized planning language or to use only the skills that we've already predefined, we can just ask people to describe the steps that accomplish these high-level plans. And the last thing to notice here is that both these high-level goals, as we set this up, and these plans are just strings. And so planning is just a conditional text generation problem. And we can learn a lot about how to plan without any action-specific data at all if we just have lots of data describing relationships between strings and strings. And so if we have access to really good models of text, those will help us generalize even to sort of taking the right actions in situations where we might not have demonstrations. So to sort of say this one more time, language is going to do the following three things. It's going to give us an easy way of collecting supervision for this high-level planning model. It's going to give us a flexible representation of skills that that planning model can operate over. And it's going to give us a way of leveraging text corpus data that'll help us generalize to new actions. So how do we actually train this model? We're going to start by doing something really simple, which is to just get a demonstration, start with a set of demonstrations for each of these tasks, and then just ask people to annotate these demonstrations, and in fact, only a small fraction of these demonstrations with natural language instructions. So a couple of things to notice here. First of all, these are just free-form language. Again, no guarantee of consistency in how these things are described across or even within tasks. We're going to assume that we have no information about the correspondence between each of these mid-level instructions and low-level actions. People are just sort of narrating what they see in a video of one of these demonstrations. And this is a pretty lightweight data collection paradigm. You can get crowd workers to do it without too much work. And most importantly, we're going to assume that we have this supervision only at training time. So we're not trying to build models that can follow these kind of fine-grained instructions. At the end of the day, we want to build an agent that just gets these high-level goals and can take the right low-level actions as a result. So here's what we have at training time. We have our environment, we have some goals, we have some demonstrations, and on a subset of these demonstrations, we have our instructions. So we have something that looks like a latent variable problem, right? On these annotated demonstrations, the correspondence between these labeled plans and actions is latent. And on unannotated demonstrations, on most of our data set, the plans themselves are latent variables as well. And so to learn, we're just going to try to fill these things in jointly with the parameters of these two policies that we're learning themselves. So, here's our model again. What we need to learn here are parameters for this language model planner, parameters for this sort of skill execution models, and these missing subtask labels and their alignments to low-level actions. And we can do this via just sort of ordinary map inference by finding hard assignments to subtasks, alignments, and parameters to maximize like the complete likelihood of this data set of demonstrations under these policies that we're learning. And it turns out that you can do this pretty effectively by just doing coordinate ascent. So we can alternate between aligning chunks of these demonstrations to instructions, relabeling each of these aligned chunks with a sort of good description of it, and then updating the model parameters for the policies themselves. And we call this algorithm semi-supervised skill learning with latent language. I'm going to go very briefly through what this actually looks like at the low level, because there's some sort of fun algorithmic details here. First of all, to align actions to plans, we can just sort of introduce some auxiliary variables that sort of tell each action which planning step it's aligned with. We can then find the highest scoring assignment to these using a dynamic program that looks a little bit like the forward algorithm for semi-Markov models. If you've seen like dynamic time warping in speech, it looks a little bit like that. So that's this step. The most interesting piece of this process is the labeling phase. Remember, what we're doing here is we're imputing a natural language description for each of these aligned segments of a plan. And once you fix this segmentation, you can sort of cast this as the labeling problem for a hidden Markov model, but it's a hidden Markov model whose state space is the space of all natural language strings. And so we have to do some fun things with learned inference models to actually make this tractable, but this lets us efficiently label all of the plans, sort of taking into account the global structure here. And finally, once we fixed all these other things, the parameter update step is just SGT. Good. So how well does this all work? So at training time, it's going to do something like this. We started with this just sequence of low-level actions and observations, and automatically inferred for this thing both a decomposition into these sorts of reusable skills, and then labeled each decomposed segment with an appropriate natural language description. And you can see that these things are sort of sensible. They learn, reusable actions for slicing and putting knives down and finding things, and so on and so forth. And at test time, when we just have these high-level goals, this model is going to act in the environment by first generating its own natural language plan from one of these goals, and then executing each step of this plan in sequence, in more or less the way that you would expect. Good. In terms of sort of numerical evaluations here, as we saw before, a policy trained via behavior cloning fails to complete even a single task. And if we annotate just 10% of the demonstrations in our data set and run this procedure that we looked at before, we can do significantly better than this end-to-end policy. Now, a lot of what makes this Alfred data set in particular hard is just navigation. There's been a bunch of recent work really sort of drilling into building better navigation skills, and this lets us be competitive with those kinds of things. Notice that these numbers are small, right? These are still really hard tasks. We absolutely haven't solved them, but we're at least like starting to make progress on a problem that you just cannot make progress on at all if you're trying to learn a reflex policy. And maybe more interestingly, if we compare it to sort of contemporary work on an easier version of this task, where models actually have access to sort of human-generated detailed plan descriptions at test time, we can match or outperform a bunch of state-of-the-art approaches there. To give us an even finer grained look at what's going on, we can do some sort of ablations of pieces of this model. Here we're looking at a slightly different evaluation metric that tells you how many subtasks you're completing rather than how many high-level goals. And so here our behavior cloning model gets 27% accuracy. And if we, again, use 10% of annotations, we do substantially better than that behavior cloning baseline. And, sort of most interesting here, you do almost as well as you do if you annotate the entire data set. So as much as this low-level action problem is hard, learning the sort of high-level structure of these plans really doesn't require that much data. And if we start with only a small sliver of our data set, pre-annotated, we can get almost all of the benefits of that kind of rich natural language supervision. So even though this is maybe hard to collect, we don't actually need that much of it. Now, we sort of said before that one of the advantages of this approach is that we could use sort of models of relationships between text and text to implement this high-level planning model. In all the results that we've been looking at so far, we started by taking a language generation model, right, pre-trained on a big text corpus and fine-tuning it to do this planning task. And if we get rid of that and we just train this model end-to-end at the high level without any kind of language-based pre-training, it does substantially worse. And so the ability to learn from text corpora alone is really important for getting all these results that we've been seeing for this sort of low-level action-taking task. Okay, so what role does language really play in all of these results? Here's a picture of our policy architecture again. We've been talking about this middle layer as a sort of natural language plan description. And a reasonable objection to everything that we've said so far is that there's no reason for this intermediate layer to specifically take the form of natural language text, right? These things might as well be symbolic representations or something else more structured, as long as we could get people to annotate them. And, just to really emphasize those sort of three roles that we outlined for language at the beginning of this section, the first reason that it's useful to really think of these things as text is that this kind of textual supervision is much easier to collect. We're just asking people to describe what they see. The second has to do with this representation in the middle layer. Unlike in these symbolic approaches, we really are letting the training data, letting sort of these free-form textual descriptions determine what the space of high-level planning operators looks like, rather than having to specify it a priori. And what we get out is this sort of open-ended library of reusable skills, where every skill is indexed by one of these natural language strings. And so in contrast to the way we normally would think about skills in robot learning, this set is open-ended, it's compositional, it's relatively easy to extend. And finally, language is really going to help these models generalize. Predictive models of text know a lot about the world. If you just ask them to predict, sort of missing words and sentences, you can recover information about perceptual properties of objects, about the tools that you need to accomplish specific goals, about the common sense layout of household environments, information about physics and environment dynamics. And I don't want to overstate, right? These models are not perfect. Even the very best, GPT, whatever things that we have today still make lots of mistakes. But they contain a lot more information than I think we can ever hope to get from any sort of reasonably sized data set of demonstrations, as long as we ask for that information in the form of text. And so if we think back to our model architecture, right, this top model, which goes from goals to plans, just a model of a relationship between text and text. And we might hope that this model can then implement all these kinds of generalizations that we learn from language data. And so in addition to the sort of standard evaluation that we can do on this data set, we can ask this model to perform all kinds of crazy out of distribution, generate plans for all kinds of crazy out of distribution goals. And we see that by implementing this top level model with a language model, we can get sort of compositional generalization to goals that require accomplishing tasks in orders that we've never seen them done before, or bringing objects into states that we've never seen those objects in before. We can get it to generalize sort of conceptually to objects that were just never mentioned anywhere in the planning data set, right? We can ask it to do things with carrots, even though there were no carrots at training time, do things with iPhones, even though there were no iPhones at training time. And you get sort of reasonable looking high level plans. There are mistakes, right? Notice that at the beginning of this carrot thing, the first step says find the lettuce, not the carrot. But in general, these plans actually look pretty sensible. And if you run them in environments, as long as you have object detectors for these new objects, you actually get to do sensible things. Maybe the most interesting case here is this rinse some tomatoes on the right. Rinse is a verb that doesn't appear anywhere in this data set. It's not clear that you would even be able to implement low-level actions for it, but the high-level plan nonetheless knows that rinsing is something that you do in a sink. And so we can generalize even to sort of novel verbs just by learning about the world and how the world is structured from text. Good. So to summarize this section, we've talked about how to train a hierarchical policy that reasons over sequences of high-level skills parameterized by natural language strings, and show that we could train these models very efficiently by treating language as a sort of latent plan specification and jointly inferring the structure of these tasks and the descriptions of these plans with the parameters of a hierarchical model. And this works, and the models that we get out are competitive with things that have much stronger supervision and generalize in all kinds of interesting and non-trivial ways. Good. So the next question that we're going to ask, and probably the one that's sort of closest to many of the people in this room, is whether we can take some of this machinery that we've developed and apply it to other problems, especially problems where we really care about the values of these latent variables themselves rather than the model's final predictions. So a canonical example of this is the problem of program synthesis. Rather than mapping from goals to actions, we're going to start with some sort of specification, like an image that we want to figure out how to draw, or a set of test cases that we want to pass. And we want to infer a program that produces these outputs or produces these input-output mappings when executed. Right, and this comes up all the time. It shows up in text editing by demonstration. It shows up in inverse graphics. I think I don't need to tell all of you to motivate the programs that this is a problem to all of you. And as before, doing well at this task is all about abstraction and composition. Just like plans are compositional, programs are compositional, right? If I have some family of related tasks, I expect pieces of programs that accomplish all of the tasks in that family to get used over and over again. And so if I can identify and name those pieces, then the space of programs that I have to reason about when I'm trying to solve one of these synthesis problems will become a lot smaller. And as before, the abstractions that we want to use here are precisely the things that tend to get names in natural language, right? The fact that we have a word pinwheel in English or the word heptagon in English sort of suggests that we should have a high-level function that will accomplish that task because it's something meaningful enough that we gave a name to it. And so here, if we can get these kinds of descriptions of the things that we're trying to synthesize, then language can again provide distant supervision about the compositional structure of this whole programming domain that we're trying to model. And in fact, we can sort of tackle this program induction problem using a model that looks very similar to the one that we saw in the previous section. We imagine a sort of generative process in which natural language descriptions of stimuli give rise to reusable program fragments via some sort of unobserved alignments. We compose these programs together, we run them, and these produce the outputs that we observe. And the sort of important difference between this and the previous problem that we looked at is that we observe only these outputs, right? The sort of defining feature of these program synthesis problems is that we don't actually have access to the programs themselves, even at training time often. And so what this means is that we have one more variable to deal with here, namely the program itself that we're trying to infer. Nevertheless, we can write down a model that looks a lot like our previous model. Rather than a natural language planner, we have some kind of language conditioned program generator. And once we've sort of generated one of these programs, we just execute it deterministically to get an output. So the only thing that we need to learn here is the parameters of this program generation model. And here, the specific form of this program generation model is going to be important. It's not just going to be a sort of neural sequence model like we had in the previous section, but instead, it's going to be backed by a discrete library of reusable program functions tagged with natural language words. And we're going to generate programs from descriptions by sort of taking all the words in the descriptions, looking up the associated program fragments, and chaining them together. To train this model, we're again going to do sort of joint inference over the parameters of the program generator, the missing programs, and the unobserved correspondences between the programs and the strings. Again, there's like a bunch of interesting algorithmic details here. I'm mostly going to skip over them, but here's a kind of rough sketch of what happens when we run this algorithm. So we start at the beginning of our training procedure with a bunch of outputs and natural language annotations for those outputs and no programs. And we're going to just do some enumerative search in the space of programs, and hopefully eventually we'll discover just by sort of chance some programs that complete or that execute to each of these stimuli that we're trying to produce. And we'll probably fail on most of these, or we'll time out, but we'll find one or two, like one that draws a small square. And once we've found a couple of programs that execute to the outputs that we want, we might eventually recognize that all of the programs whose associated outputs contain the word square contain little reusable fragments, contain a subprogram that looks like this. And this is going to be a cue to the model that we should abstract this out. And so during that parameter update step, we're actually going to sort of factor out a piece of the piece of the program that we reliably align to the word square. We're going to create a new function labeled square that encapsulates this sort of generic square drawing functionality. And we'll rewrite all of the programs that we already found in terms of this square function. And now we'll go back and we'll do our search procedure again, but with an improved library containing all the primitives in our original language, plus this new square function. And this means that all of our other target outputs that have squares have simpler representations. We'll find them faster. And then we can sort of pull out more reusable pieces. Maybe some of these pieces don't actually have names that we can align them to, like the thing that we draw that draws strokes, but we can repeat this procedure until we've sort of discovered everything. A couple of other important things to notice here, and I realize that there should have been a citation on the slide, and there's not. The sort of skeleton of this procedure is inherited from the Dreamcoder procedure, which I suspect many of you are familiar with from Kevin Ellis and colleagues. And the main thing that we're doing here is just when we do this compression step, when we figure out which program fragments to extract, we're using language to tell us which to do that, right? So your condition for being sort of lifted up to being a reusable function is not just that you occur frequently in this data set, but that you actually have a consistent name that people speaking language use to pick you out. And as we're going to see in a minute, this actually helps you learn much better libraries for these tasks. Other interesting things here, there's a bunch of like linguistic sophistication that goes into how you actually score the correspondence between program fragments and strings. There's all kinds of things that assume that people are communicating cooperatively and not using the same word to refer to too many different concepts. And I encourage you to read the paper for details. Okay, so how does this work? We've evaluated this on a bunch of different data sets. I'm just going to show you this graphics domain that we've been using as kind of a running example here. So these are the images in this domain. These are the kinds of annotations that we get for it. And notice that there can be a lot of diversity in the language that people use for referring to these things, the names of the abstractions, the detail with which the stimuli are described, and so on. When we run this procedure and when we compare it to the sort of base synthesis algorithm that it's running on top of, language really buys you quite a lot. you solve a larger fraction of these synthesis problems and you solve them faster just by getting, sort of order of 100 or 200 natural language descriptions of all of these stimuli. And you can see that, in fact, the kinds of functions that we learn correspond to things that have names in language, right? We learn a semicircle, we learn a sort of generic n-gon function, and in fact, we learn a whole big library of these things, all tagged with sensible-looking natural language descriptions. And so what's cool about this is that once we've learned this library using language, we can apply this library to new synthesis tasks, even if we don't have these natural language hints. Just like in the policy learning section, once we'd sort of learned our library of skills, we could plan using those skills without actually having sort of detailed plans. Good. Another cool thing that you can do with this framework is sort of answer scientific questions with it. So tools for automatically associating word meanings with natural language, or with sort of programmatic tools for associating words with programmatic representations of the meanings of those words. Turns out to be useful for asking all kinds of questions about why the sort of lexicon that we get in human languages is shaped like it is. So here's some collaboration with some folks in the psych department at UCSD that's using these questions to answer, using these tools, to answer questions about the lexicon, and showing specifically that the way in which you carve up the space of possible meanings and the set of concepts that get words seem to be minimizing some sort of information theoretic criterion that trades off exactly the sort of complexity of the vocabulary with the difficulty of describing any individual thing that you might be asked to describe. Good. So what we've done in this section is extended this approach to policy learning to do program learning as well. And on very tiny data sets of programs, we saw that this model that we described was able to use language to solve a bunch of challenging program induction problems. And that in particular, what we get out at the end is a sort of library of functions that correspond to words in natural language. And once we have this library, we can use it both to do sort of language conditional program synthesis and unconditional search. Good. Man, I've never gotten to do this final portion of the talk, so I'm very excited about this. What I want to wrap up with here is a pretty different problem. Which is now, still about using language in support of these other kinds of learning problems, but specifically using language as a tool for interpretability, of generating natural language descriptions of things that sort of free-form models that we've trained have already learned from scratch. Right, if we're going to use language as a teaching tool, if we're going to accomplish that sort of high-level goal that we laid out in the beginning of natural language supervision for everything, we should also be able to use language to probe how well this teaching is learning, right? We want to be able to ask questions like, what has some neural net image classifier that I've trained actually learned about the problem of image classification? Now, what has this entire network learned is a really complicated question to ask. Let's start with something even simpler by asking about individual computations, individual pieces of the computation performed by a given model. So if I've trained some sort of neural network classifier, say, I want to be able to ask about individual neurons, individual features in this classifier, what their function is. Now, how might we go about answering this question at all? Well, what does a neuron do? Right, and sort of fundamentally, a neuron is something that responds to inputs. It maps from, in like a convolutional vision model, some input region of an image to some sort of scalar activation value. And so one way of understanding what it is that a neuron does is to look at the set of model inputs or regions that it responds to and try to figure out what those things all have in common. And so if we do this for some particular neuron in some particular scene classification model, you can see that there's an individual one that seems to light up only on images of lamps. But is it all lamps? Is it just lamps that have white shades? Right? This is a real sort of cognitively demanding task. We probably need to look at a large set of images to really understand what this neuron is doing. This spot the difference problem is hard for people. It's something that we give to people as puzzles. And so it's not necessarily going to be a really scalable way to understand everything that, that a network does. But if we can sort of automate the process of answering the question, what do all these pictures have in common? Or what is this network paying attention to? Then we can start to get this sort of high level understanding. So to the extent that we think we need these kinds of high level descriptions, we can pose this just as a problem of sort of approximating the function implemented by a given neuron, right? This map from input image regions to scalar values by something that we know how to interpret more easily. And I'm like really going to skip over all the details here, but you can pose this either as something that looks like a program synthesis problem or something that looks like an image captioning problem. So we're either going to try to find a little program built from primitives that we've actually implemented ourselves and we know what they do, things that like detect water, look for blue regions and stuff like that. And search in the space of programs composed from these pieces until we find one that matches this neuron that we're trying to explain. Or just saying, you know what, this neuron picks out a set of image regions. We have really good tools for generating natural language descriptions of image regions. Let's just throw an image captioning model or an image captioning model with some probabilistic bells and whistles at this problem. And either way, what we wind up with is some kind of symbolic description in terms of primitives whose sort of functions we understand of what it is that this neuron is doing. And in this case, this is a real neuron from, I think, also a scene classification problem that we actually label automatically as something that responds to water, but only water that's not blue. Good, and so you can do this at scale. I'm showing here examples of the natural language version of this rather than the program synthesis version of this. And you can see you get like fine-grained descriptions of low-level things like the top boundaries of horizontal objects. You get sort of high-level semantic things like this is a neuron that responds to keyboards, and various sort of interesting mid-level textural things like objects with ridges, slender objects. You get cool like descriptions of symmetries and neurons that respond to vertically symmetric objects and things like that as well. Okay, so what is a model like this? What is a procedure for labeling neurons with descriptions of their function actually good for? And one thing that you can use, or one thing that you can do is use these descriptions to actually make models better, right? So a sort of standard thing that's known if you train these models, sort of big models on data sets of images and text, things like CLIP, you wind up with individual neurons that really sort of conflate textual information with visual information. I guess I don't have the slide anymore, but you can trick a model into classifying an apple as an iPod by just writing the word iPod in Sharpie on the apple. And this is bad. We don't want this. We want our image classifiers, I think in general, to be image classifiers. So how might we use these kinds of descriptions to remove this, to sort of make image classifiers image classifiers? Well, one thing we can do is we can start with a data set, that sort of mixes images without labels and images with labels, train a model on this data set, and then run this neuron description procedure. And what we get out at the end is a description of a bunch of neurons that respond to the text features in these images and not the visual features in these images. So here's a neuron that specifically responds to words and letters that we've automatically labeled as a thing that responds to words and letters. We can then just go into the network and delete all of the neurons or delete the most frequent neurons whose descriptions indicate that they're text detectors rather than image detectors. And if we do this, this model actually gets more robust to these kinds of text-based adversarial attacks, right? A greater fraction of the time, and I think this is actually like half or a little more than half of the way to the sort of baseline, the performance of a classifier that doesn't have these text features at all, we can get by just deleting neurons that seem to respond to the features that we don't want. Another thing that we can do is use this technique to sort of figure out whether models are picking up on features that we don't want them to pick up on, or that we don't expect them to pick up on, even if we're not going to sort of intervene in the model after the fact. So there's been a lot of interest recently in sort of developing like privacy-aware versions of standard image classification data sets where we remove the information about people from those data sets to make them safer to distribute and all that. So you can get a version of ImageNet now in which all of the faces have been blurred out. And a reasonable question is whether we can what models learn about faces from a data set in which all of the faces have been blurred, in which it's never seen a sort of normal face. And sure enough, we can just do this by running our neuron label procedure, figuring out how many neurons have descriptions that indicate they're sensitive to faces or other sort of facial features. This blurring procedure does reduce the number of face-sensitive neurons across like any model that you might try to train on this data set, but not completely. And even inside this data set of blurred out faces, you wind up with models producing individual neurons that are selective to, or mostly selective to faces, and sometimes faces belong to even, sort of narrower demographic categories, like mostly female presenting faces up at the top here, and things like that. So we can use this as a tool for really auditing models in addition to editing them directly. Finally, we can use this as, just sort of a fun toy to design adversarial attacks. So here's an individual neuron that responds to both pictures of animals and pictures of vehicles. And you can use this to construct weird inputs where, you put a turtle on top of a truck and the truck gets classified as a Jeep, or a snowplow gets classified as a Jeep, or a tank on some pretzels and it gets classified as a hermit crab. So, the sort of classic tank problem with neural nets still exists, even in the biggest models that we have today. And, I think the most important thing is that this gives us a tool for answering some of these bigger questions that we asked at the beginning of the section about how we might understand, in symbolic terms, the computations performed by entire deep networks, right? That we have some tool that lets us hook into what every step of the computation that one of these models is performing does. We can't always produce these descriptions reliably. And there's, far too many of them for any person to just like stare at them all and understand what's going on. But once we have this first step, once we have some even noisy neuron labels, we can start to think about, okay, how do we identify the ones that are relevant? How do we identify interesting circuits? How do we label larger pieces of computation in a way that we might hope ultimately gives us, again, in symbolic terms, a handle on what it is that the models that we train are actually doing. Cool. So to summarize here, right, we showed that we could sort of take some of these same tools for sort of reasoning about natural language strings, apply them to interpretability problems rather than to sort of learning problems, and that we could use this sort of symbolic understanding that we get of models from labeling neurons with programs or labeling neurons with strings to really sort of understand and sometimes even control what it is that our models are doing. And I'll wrap up here. So to sort of summarize this whole talk, I've been presenting methods that use language as a tool for training and at least superficially understanding deep networks that have symbolic scaffolding inside them. We saw that we could use natural language annotations at training time to generate hierarchical policies that can sort of plan in symbolic terms, to infer programs in which program libraries correspond to words in the natural language lexicon, and to label neurons in deep networks with symbolic descriptions of their computation. And I hope that what this lays out is the building blocks of maybe a bigger toolkit that lets us use language as a source of information about this kind of latent structure in all of the tasks that we care about in the machine learning world. And I'll wrap up there. I'll credit, of course, to the students who did all this work, and thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for a great talk. So we have a few questions from the audience here.
So in the experiment that you showed that had the neuron that responded to female presenting faces, how do you know it's actually responding to the female face rather than the context? So did you do an experiment where you grafted like a male presenting face onto like hair, and does you get the same results?
Yeah, so we for here we haven't done that specific experiment. In fact, it could be that what this model is picking up on is the hair rather than like the facial features. So yeah, I don't want to maybe make too strong a claim about like what mechanistically this neuron is responding to. And notice that the label is just faces and not claiming anything more specific than that. But if we look at the actual exemplar, it seems like there's something else going on, and we could look more closely at this to figure out what it is.
Thanks for the great talk. I enjoyed the connection to interpretability and control for models. And it seems like the high-level premise is that a natural language is a good mechanism for posing and solving lots of interesting problems. So I'm wondering, can you imagine any kinds of tasks that you want to ask a model to do that natural language would be cumbersome or even inhibit the solving of those tasks? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so if you think like the kinds of plans that we're generating here, let me see if I can actually pull up the slides. right, really involve these kinds of like high level semantic features of plans. And sometimes you have hard planning problems that are just hard motion planning problems, right? That don't involve any of this complex semantics and just require you to like figure out how to move your arm in just such a way to get it through some keyhole and configuration space. And like most of the time, if you like one thing that I have learned from talking to robotics researchers is that often we don't have good words for talking about those kinds of failure modes. So yeah, I certainly don't want to suggest that this is like gonna solve all planning problems ever, but that a lot of the things that are hard about the kinds of, at least some class of long-term planning problems that we have today have to do with figuring out how to order these sort of high-level semantic things. And that's where language is really helping us. I think the long-term hope would be to like make this talk to like real motion planning at the low level and to try to figure out how to get this kind of symbolic scaffolding into the sorts of existing planning machinery that already works really well for the things that language is not good at.
I see. Yeah, it seems like it's useful. Communicate with agents that also use language as social methods. Thank you.
Hi, Jacob.
Oh, yeah.
So regarding the program synthesis work that you mentioned, the libraries of programs that you started with, those are not manually constructed, those are learned, first of all, is that right?
Yeah, well, so the
Ultimately,
yeah, so in like all of these domains, you start with a very, very simple set of primitives that like for these graphics applications are basically the logo. Like you can draw a line, you can take the pen up, pen down, turn, and that's it. So you need some base DSL to synthesize on top of.
I see. Oh, I see. So from there, as a basis, which are manually constructed, you are segmenting.
Yeah.
Could you talk about the segmentation aspect?
Yeah, so what's actually going on under the hood in this step in particular, we have our set of initial programs we can get using various kinds of compression algorithms, candidate fragments of those programs to extract out and make into their own library functions. And what we do is for each of those candidates, we say, if I were to rewrite a program in terms of this function that I've proposed, how much would I be able to compress both the strings and the text in my data set? And so if I find a program, if I find the square function, then I'm always going to be able to predict wherever that function appears that the word square should appear in the corresponding natural language description, and these programs will be easy to compress. Does that make sense? Essentially, yeah. So you can think of, there's a couple of different ways of thinking about what's going on. There's a sort of like minimum description length interpretation of this, which is like what's in the Dreamcoder paper. We have a probabilistic interpretation where you have some prior over libraries and programs that penalizes long libraries. And so what you're trying to do is actually maximize the joint probability of your programs and your strings under sort of prior over programs and a conditional model of strings given programs. And so the more the functions of those programs align with the strings in your language, the easier it is to predict the language, and therefore the higher the probability of under the joint.
So I'm wondering about the last. So in my mind, like the second and third part of the talk were at some point should maybe come together. So if you could comment a little bit on that, sort of how could we use this self-supervised natural language annotation to refactor neural networks in a similar style of refactoring code practice?
Oh, interesting. I thought you were going in an opposite direction with that. So this is a great question. So there's two things that you could do, right? One is to say, we have these deep network models. We would prefer to replace them with sort of symbolic surrogates that we totally understand if we could. And if we can, sort of like really get a description of, all the steps in the computation that our deep network is performing, we can identify, the circuit that's the chair detector, or the circuit that's the curve detector, or whatever else. Maybe we can sort of modularly swap that out with a trusted symbolic implementation. And so you can sort of think of the deletion experiment as doing that, as like saying, okay, we're going to remove the pieces of this computation that symbolically we don't think are right. But a really natural thing to do would also be to say, okay, I have, something that's like an okay face detector or a face detector with problems. Let me replace it with one that I've sort of independently certified. Another thing that you could imagine doing is actually using which I guess is the sort of extreme version of that, is using this as a way of ultimately synthesizing like complete symbolic programs, right? SGD is an amazing search algorithm. Maybe if what we want is like a fully symbolic top to bottom model, the way to get that is by first training one of these deep network models rather than doing the enumerative search like we're doing on this slide, and then post hoc figuring out which pieces of the computation that model has discovered and sort of rounding them off completely to symbolic computations that we understand. And even if you can't like actually do that exactly at the neuron level, this gives you useful heuristics about the kinds of features that you might need or the ways in which the chunks of your programs like should chain together.
So tiny follow-up. I was actually thinking more in terms of like actually still maintaining the neural end-to-end neural aspects so that you can back propagate maybe learn other neural modules internally.
Yeah, so another thing that you can do is, look at these descriptions and say, okay, this neuron is trying to be a keyboard detector, but maybe it's not a perfect keyboard detector. Let me at training time say, I want every piece of this network or some, 50% of the neurons in this network to do things that I have names for. And so once it becomes clear that you're trying to do something, go out and get, if you have a targeted supervision for that task, and like enforce neurons that neurons are interpretable, or maybe that they even sort of match the functions that that you have ground truth for from somewhere else. This is like an incredibly interesting computational problem, because if you want to sort of do that naively, every time you're taking a gradient step while you're training the original deep network model, you now have to go through and do this labeling phase, which right now takes like order of a couple of hours. And so figuring out, how to do that infrequently or approximately or whatever in a way that you can then just like tack on a regularizer that says, in addition to whatever it is that you're trying to do, like be describable, I think is a very interesting future direction. And not at all obvious how to proceed on it immediately. People have done this for classification, like just taking networks and saying encourage all else equal neurons to be class discriminative, and that usually hurts performance. So you don't like, it's not actually the case that right now we have a rich enough vocabulary for using this as a training time regularizer, but maybe with language rather than just classes, we might. Good.
So in the context of the last paper, I'm curious about the applications of language to property. And so a very common issue is you want to find some rare category on your data set. You can spend all this time like finding examples and do like pay your favorite thing, like labels, lots of labeling, right? But here I would imagine something like you could give a natural language description of the object, like the traffic cone is the word cone commonly found on roads, and use that to bootstrap the process of identifying these data set if they map onto some neurons that likely can identify properties of objects. So I'm curious if you within that, if that's a useful thing, if that could supplant this sort of image labeling paradigm, especially if you're part of the.
Yeah, so I guess a couple of thoughts there. One, right, so a very old trick is to say, I'm going to start with sort of representations of text. I'm going to encourage representations produced in the final layer of my neural network to match textual descriptions of the stimuli that I have. So this is how, like modern joint image and text representation learning models work, but there are versions of this going back to like the early days of deep network models. And so, and those also can do this kind of zero shot thing that you're describing, where, I have some joint embedding space in which representations of images live, representations of strings, or, whether they're class names or definitions live, and I do zero shot classification by looking at how similar these things are to each other. And so the question is then whether you can do better by looking for individual neurons that implement these things rather than just using these sort of like abstract representation spaces. I'm a little skeptical that you would expect to find these things at the neuron level, although I suppose it's, or, by sort of like composing logically pieces of neurons together. But I think there are also natural extensions of this technique that work on sort of directions in representation space, or directions on the unrolled manifold, that lives at some particular layer of the network, and there things might work a little bit better. Tying that now to some of the sort of bigger themes in this talk, another way in which you can sort of bring language to bear on that problem is using it not just as like a representation of individual class, but as a prior, right? So if I'm trying to classify a traffic cone and I don't know what the right set of features is for a traffic cone, but I have some model that can look at an object and say, okay, here's all the features that are associated with this object, then you can just ask a language model like, hey, I have this thing, it's orange, it's triangular, it's sitting on top of a street, what is it? And then that might be a way of getting this kind of information. And that's definitely something that doesn't live in these just like joint image text representation learning approaches, but that might very well live in bigger models, or in models of text alone.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It's really, really interesting. So I had two questions. The first one is, how much data do you need to have this super specific neurons? Because I'm thinking about play, which needs like a humongous amount of data. And the second question is, have you thought of any human experiment? Because we do also have neurons in our brain which are specific to some words and stuff like that. And I think it will be really interesting also to the extent of finding some adversarial attacks for humans. Like, what if instead of like a turtle on a tank, we find some other picture which we misclassified, like, yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah, both great questions. So on the how much data do you need for this? So for these experiments right here, we went out and collected, because if you take like standard image classification data sets, nobody is saying, oh, this is a picture of white horizontal lines. That's just like not text that anybody types in photos that winds up on the internet. Or at least that winds up in standard classification data sets. And so we collected like order of 10,000 just like descriptions of image regions in order to train this model. What's nice is that those seem to generalize a little bit across both tasks and model architectures. And that's actually what's going on in the slide, is that if you take image regions that you've determined were useful for ImageNet classification, and then you use them to label a model that was trained not to do ImageNet classification, you get pretty good neuron labels anyway. In terms of how we could overcome that, I mean, one thing is to say, don't do this with learned models, do this with, with sort of explicit symbolic models, and then you don't need any data at all. You just need a good search procedure and a sort of expressive enough programming language. Another thing is to say, okay, CLIP required a huge amount of data to train, or any of these big joint image text required a ton of data to train, but that probably is good at labeling all these image regions. And so, one thing that we're experimenting with right now, and I don't know how like technically interesting this is, but I think that that you could do to scale these methods up is exactly to see what can we do with just like big off-the-shelf joint vision language models to perform this labeling task, and do crazy things like ask CLIP to label its own internal neurons or whatever else. Yeah, and then on the neuroscience question, I mean, one natural question is just whether any of the recording technologies that we have right now will actually sort of give you things at a level of resolution that allows you to identify these like very specific features, if those are in fact localized in the brain at all. So we talk a lot with Fedorenko's group at MIT, and they have all this great work on localizing where various pieces of language processing happen in the brain. We're sort of optimistic about using some of this machinery to answer some of those questions, but I suspect the actual things that you find will be much, much coarser and, like at the level of, this is where like semantically implausible sentences with like bad physics live versus this is where semantically implausible sentences with bad social dynamics live and things like that.
So yeah, I want to go back to what they were saying about learning these functions from, like these reusable functions in the part of for code. I want to know, you're going back to natural language in training time, right? Or are you not doing that? Like,
What do you,
using a natural language description of these learn functions to decide which functions are their candidates to be learned or to be abstracted to library functions?
yeah, so there's two things going on here, one of which I totally glossed over, which is that when you do this parameter update step, this library learning step, you're using language to tell you which like possible segmentations of the programs correspond to good library candidates. Another thing that we're doing is during this search phase, we actually have a language conditional search heuristic that looks at the description of a problem that you haven't solved and says, okay, I'm trying to make a medium square. I don't yet have a program that makes a medium square, but hey, I have a square function in the library. And so I'm gonna like sample that more often or prioritize that when I'm doing my search in the space of programs.
Okay, and how this translates to, functions that probably we don't have words to describe in natural language?
Yeah, so you can, in this compression step in particular, pull out functions that don't correspond to natural language strings. You just pay a cost for them in the likelihood, right? So you're going to choose the function that sort of minimizes the length of all your programs, minimizes the length of the library, and maximizes the predictability of the text. And if you find some function that like really lets you shrink all the programs down, even if it doesn't make it easier to predict text, you're going to abstract that out. And let me see if I have real examples of some of those things.
So we're going to do two more questions, and then we're going to go to the break. But you can ask more questions during the break.
So I have a quick question. So the last talk, when you generate descriptions for neurons, I think I missed how you tell that the descriptions are correct.
Yeah, this is a very good question. So different for each of these things, what we're doing in the program synthesis version is looking at I'm going to build some program. The program is also going to pick out a set of image regions in the training set. And I'm just going to look at, like in pixel space, how well those regions align with the regions that the neural net responds to. So I think I might have this slide hidden. Dang, it's just gone. Okay, but basically what happens is that you propose the program corresponding to water that is not blue picks out a slightly different set of images over here, and you can measure the overlap between those things. And what's nice about that is it actually gives us a measure of like the quality of the best explanation that we were able to generate. There's a bunch of other claims that you can make about relating model robustness to the quality of a given like neuron explanation. And there's some funny things in NLP models where the more explainable they are, the more likely they are to make incorrect predictions because they're finding sort of bad heuristics. But yeah, so that's the program synthesis version. And then in the captioning version, we're learning a joint model of the sort of distribution over, or learning a model of the joint distribution over image regions and descriptions that people assign to those regions. And then we're just like the quality of a caption or the quality of a neuron description is the pointwise mutual information between the description and the image region with respect to that joint.
So it's as good as your best caption score.
Yeah. And so in particular, in the ways that like all neural network models are weird and non-robust, this captioning model is weird and non-robust and is probably subject to adversarial attacks. And you definitely find bad captions in this data set, but they're good enough that you can do the things with them that we were describing.
Yeah, I think the first what we talked about the plan. To oversimplify, but I would like an understanding that you are factoring in the knowledge found in text corpora into the essentially shoving it into the shape of a plan that is executable by humans because you're getting humans to annotate and have a language. So if I assumed a robot that was a foot tall, you could still do that. You could factor out and shove it in the shape of a different kind of plan with a different embodied data.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So, right. So what's actually the sort of data collection paradigm here is people look at videos of these agents doing things and they describe them. And so to the extent that the plans that those agents are doing are things that people can't do, you still wind up with descriptions at the level of individual annotations. But with respect to these like corpus priors, it is definitely the case that, if I'm as a tiny robot need to accomplish a plan in some non-standard way, I can't reach the microphone or the microwave because it's too tall. If the language model tells me to use the microwave, then I'm sort of going to be in trouble. And so one thing that like future direction here that we're really interested in is making those plans like making that planning procedure look more like an actual planning procedure, right? We've been talking about them as plans, but in fact, you just have a language model that's sort of generating them conditioned on goals and initial observations. In the actual planning literature, you can do sort of real like search procedures that say, okay, if I take this action on this actual robot, it's going to bring the world into this particular state. These are also things that that language models know about, but if you sort of could explicitly reason in terms of like preconditions and postconditions, I think that would make it easier to deal with the kinds of changes that you're talking about there. And so and this is something that people have started to think about. So like if you saw the Say-Can paper, which came out about 6 months after this, like sort of does that where you have a model of, okay, if I execute this high level plan, like what are my odds of success? They're pre-committing to a like fixed inventory of low level actions. And so it's a little easier to figure out whether things are going to succeed or fail. But yeah, something like that, something that like actually lets you reason about, have I satisfied the preconditions for doing this high level step would let you generalize in that way. And I think you can get that information from language models as well, even if the plan prior itself is sometimes a little off.
All right, so one last short question.
So I just had a question also about the first work. I think you like really quickly flashed the results for non-pre-trained language models.
Yeah.
And I was just curious, like qualitatively, do those plans, are they even like grammatical? Do they make any sense? Like how much worse is it? Because like the only language that model gets is the plans from humans. There's like 100 plans or something.
Yeah, it's I think 800.
Well, I mean, it's like way less.
Yeah,
than-
not enough to train a big language model. Yeah, exactly. So I think I would have to go back and double check. I think they're mostly grammatical, and the failure mode is that you generate like a plan that looks like a well-formed plan, but like not for the goal that you're trying to do right now. And right, the first thing that these models often do is just like memorize the strings that they in training, and that's basically what goes wrong here.
All right, well, let's thank the speaker. Have a break right now.